The winter of 1347 was not merely a cold season. For most of Europe's peasants, it was a merciless, deadly test of survival. Modern people are accustomed to escaping the cold with a simple press of a button on a smart thermostat. Medieval inhabitants had neither radiators, nor central heating, nor reliable double-pane windows. Instead, they had a secret building material that literally saved millions of lives. Today, this material can be found literally underfoot in any village. If you were to suggest to a modern builder that they use it to construct a house, they would tap their temple in disbelief. Yet it was precisely this substance that possessed unique properties capable of retaining heat during severe frosts. Moreover, these properties were so impressive that modern science is still studying them today. Ancient engineers discovered the secret of perfect thermal insulation long before the emergence of physics as a science. We're not talking about sturdy stone or expensive wood for noble lords. The elite often froze in their massive castles, buffeted by icy winds. Ordinary people relied on a mixture of ordinary mud, dry grass, and animal waste. It sounds like a recipe for a terrible disaster or a source of deadly infectious diseases. In reality, it turned out to be the most ingenious survival technology in all of medieval history. This incredible story explains why humanity was able to survive the harsh climate changes of the past at all. Many historical facts about peasant life sound like complete fiction or gross exaggeration, but behind every strange decision lay a cold calculation, paid for with the lives of those who made mistakes. Today, we'll delve into the chemistry and physics of this strange construction process. It turns out that our ancestors understood the laws of thermodynamics far better than we think. Viewers will have to forget all the myths imposed by romantic films about knights and princesses. The real Middle Ages smelled completely different and demanded constant, hard physical labor. Survival depended on the ability to turn waste into a reliable fortress against the harsh elements. Ahead lies the story of how clay and manure literally saved Europe from freezing to death. This journey into the world of forgotten technologies will change our perception of comfort forever. Medieval winters were strikingly different from the pretty pictures on Christmas cards. Temperatures in Europe often dropped so low that major rivers froze over. Historical chronicles describe instances when birds literally fell dead out of the sky. People faced a cold that penetrated to the very bone and left the weak no chance. Under such conditions, an ordinary wooden house without insulation turned into a veritable ice trap. Scientists would later refer to such weather anomalies of that time as the Little Ice Age. Ordinary people understood that walls frozen through meant inevitable illness or even death. Today, builders use fiberglass, foam, and complex membranes to retain heat. Ancient architects had no idea such high-tech materials even existed. Yet their survival instinct worked far better than any modern engineering theory. They had to rely on what was literally right under their feet. And the most amazing thing is that this free raw material did the job just as well as modern insulation. The skills of using natural resources were passed down from generation to generation as the greatest treasure. In the absence of institutions and laboratories, people became experts in geology and chemistry through practical experience. They knew the properties of every type of soil in their region and knew how to combine them correctly. Ordinary earth in their hands turned into a building material with unique characteristics. It was a time when practical experience truly triumphed over theoretical research. Many historical films depict peasants living in drafty shacks made of bare planks. This is a huge mistake by Hollywood directors who have never spent a night in the woods in December. A real medieval house was built using a completely different, almost ingenious technology. Peasants understood perfectly well that even a tiny crack in the wall at night meant certain death from hypothermia. Therefore, they created a system that turned thin walls into an impenetrable thermal shield. Filmmakers often sacrifice historical accuracy to create a picture of hopeless poverty and filth. But in reality, medieval people were extremely resourceful when it came to their own comfort. They couldn't afford the luxury of ignoring the laws of physics and drafts. For them, a house was not just a place to sleep, but a complex engineering structure designed to sustain life. Every detail of the building had its own clear, functional purpose and logic. At the heart of this technology lay a method that English historians call wattle and daub. The Russian translation is simple: But the essence of the process goes far deeper than simply smearing mud. First, the builders created a sturdy frame from interwoven branches, usually using flexible willow or hazel. This woven framework functioned exactly like modern rebar and reinforced concrete structures. It gave the wall flexibility and incredible strength, capable of withstanding strong gusts of icy wind. This framework was made from local tree species that possessed the necessary flexibility and durability. The weaving was a true art form, requiring specific skills and dexterity. The branches were tightly fitted together, forming a single mesh that held the shape of the building. This structure allowed the house to expand and contract slightly with temperature changes without collapsing. In essence, it was an early form of frame construction, which we still use today. But a basket of branches alone did not retain heat at all. And this is where that very secret mixture came into play, one that saved entire generations. To modern city dwellers, its recipe might seem like a health inspector's worst nightmare. It was based on ordinary clay, mixed with water until it formed a thick paste. However, clay alone would inevitably crack and crumble to the ground as it dried. Chopped straw or hay was added to the mixture to create internal binding fibers. The straw acted as micro-reinforcement, distributing stress within the material as it dried. This prevented the formation of deep cracks through which cold could penetrate. But even with straw, the mixture required additional binding elements for better adhesion. Craftsmen were constantly looking for ways to make the mixture more pliable and reliable. Modern engineers use exactly the same principle when creating reinforced composite materials. The only difference is that in the Middle Ages, this technology was discovered through trial and error. But clay and straw alone were not enough to create the ideal mortar. The mixture turned out too stiff and did not adhere well to the woven wooden framework. Builders needed a powerful natural adhesive capable of firmly binding all the ingredients together. Each region had its own little secrets and additions to the general mixture recipe. In some places, sand was added, in others, fine gravel, depending on the composition of the local soil. All efforts were aimed at making the walls as monolithic and dense as possible. A high-quality mortar had to be easy to apply and at the same time not slide down under its own weight. This required a perfect balance between all the components of this ancient plaster. And here is where the most interesting part begins, something that might come as a bit of a shock to modern-day clean freaks. The third and most important component of this life-saving mixture was fresh cow or horse manure. Yes, entire villages literally plastered their homes with animal excrement. It sounds like an absolutely crazy idea, capable of causing mass epidemics, but in reality, it was one of the greatest biochemical discoveries of the time. This approach may seem wild, but it was dictated by exceptional practicality. In the Middle Ages, nothing went to waste, and every resource was used as efficiently as possible. Manure was available in vast quantities on any peasant farm. Its beneficial properties had been recognized by people since ancient times. Over time, this evolved into a refined technique that was passed down by word of mouth. The manure of herbivorous animals possesses unique physical properties that city dwellers are unaware of. It is incredibly sticky, malleable, and contains a vast amount of semi-digested plant fibers. When mixed with clay, these fibers created an ideal viscous mass that adhered firmly to the walls. Once completely dry, this substance turned into a hard, almost stone-like shell. This shell did not let a single drop of cold air in from the outside and did not let precious heat escape from the inside. The organic acids contained in the manure reacted with the minerals in the clay. This created strong chemical bonds that made the material resistant to precipitation. The result was a kind of natural plastic that feared neither snow nor rain. The wind simply couldn't find a way through such a monolithic and dense structure. The walls became a reliable barrier between the cozy hearth and the harsh reality of the street. Modern people would surely wonder about the terrible smell in such a house. Surprisingly, the dried clay manure mixture has absolutely no smell. The sun and wind completely killed all bacteria, leaving only a durable organic polymer. Such an eco-friendly material would cost a fortune today at trendy architectural firms. Medieval people, however, obtained it completely free of charge, simply by cleaning out their barns. The drying process was accompanied by fermentation, which neutralized all unpleasant odors. Once the work was finished, the house smelled only of freshness and dry earth. It's amazing, but this finish was even more hygienic than many modern synthetic coatings. It didn't release toxic substances and was completely safe for the residents. It was easy to breathe in such a house, and a special microclimate was created. To achieve the right consistency, the peasants had to knead this slurry with their bare feet. It was hard, exhausting labor that lasted all day long, but as a result, they ended up with walls capable of withstanding any natural disaster. No modern plastic siding is as effective in harsh conditions. This dirty process was the foundation of survival for the entire medieval civilization. Once the house was completely covered with this strange mixture, the real magic of physics began. The clay and manure mixture possessed what is known as an incredibly high thermal mass. This meant that the walls functioned as giant natural heat accumulators. During the day, they slowly absorbed the heat from the hearth burning in the center of the small room. At night, when the fire died down, the walls began to gradually release that heat back into the room. This effect helped prevent sudden temperature fluctuations inside the dwelling. Even if the fire in the hearth went out briefly, the room remained at a comfortable temperature. The walls seemed to breathe warmth, creating an invisible cocoon around the sleeping people. To people of that time, it was akin to a miracle. Those simple laws of nature were at work. It was thermal inertia that saved lives during the harshest nighttime frosts. Modern homes made of lightweight materials cool down within a couple of hours after the heat is turned off. The Lord's stone castles also froze through and through, turning into icy crypts for the nobility. But the humble peasant mud huts maintain an incredibly stable temperature throughout the long night. A lord in his enormous castle might shiver from the cold under 5 fur blankets. At the same time, simple peasants slept peacefully in the warmth of their mud huts. The vast stone halls of the palaces required a colossal amount of firewood for heating. But even with a constant fire, the stone remained cold and damp to the touch. The peasants' walls, however, were warm and dry thanks to their unique properties. The poor unconsciously took advantage of materials that were inaccessible to the rich. This is a paradoxical example of how simplicity triumphed over pomp and grandeur. It seems utterly unfair that the poor lived in greater climatic comfort than the wealthy elite. But the harsh laws of thermodynamics pay no heed to titles or the size of one's wallet. Stone conducts cold quickly, while porous clay mixed with straw blocks it completely. Today, engineers call this effect the thermal resistance of building materials. 13th century peasants simply called it common sense in a sincere desire to survive. They understood that a large room volume is the enemy of heat retention. That is why peasant homes were compact and had low ceilings. Every cubic centimeter of space had to be heated efficiently. While the lords spent fortunes on firewood, the peasants got by with an armful of brushwood. The efficiency of their heating system still commands respect among construction experts. It is important to understand the scale of the work required to insulate even a small village house. The family had to manually mix tons of clay, manure, and icy water. It was incredibly exhausting, dirty, and extremely hard physical labor. Modern builders use powerful automatic concrete mixers for such volumes. Ancient people relied only on their own muscles and a panic-stricken fear of the coming winter. Each batch of mortar required hundreds or thousands of stomps to mix. The clay resisted their efforts, becoming increasingly viscous over time. People worked until they were drenched in sweat, despite the autumn chill outside. It was a true marathon of endurance, in which giving up was not an option. Fatigue was a constant companion for the builders throughout the weeks of work. After applying the mixture, the most critical moment in the entire construction process arrived. The walls had to dry completely before the first serious frost set in. If the water inside the clay froze before it dried, the entire insulating layer would simply fall off in chunks. Nature allowed no room for the slightest mistake or delay in the construction deadline. The entire process depended on perfect timing and the favor of the autumn weather. The builders kept a close watch on the sky, trying to predict the approach of the first cold snap. Any prolonged rain could spell disaster, washing away the still unset mixture. They had to erect temporary shelters made of straw and animal hides to protect the fresh walls. People lived in constant tension until the surface of the house had hardened. It was a real race against the weather, with the comfort of the entire winter at stake. The result was a composite material that, in terms of its properties, surpassed many modern equivalents. It was highly breathable, wicking excess moisture away from the interior, yet it kept drafts out. A house made of this material could easily stand for several centuries with proper care. In England, buildings constructed using this technology 500 years ago still stand today. This casts serious doubt on the much-touted reliability of modern plastic panels. The old craftsmen knew that the secret to durability lay in the right balance of components. Their structures withstood hurricane-force winds, torrential rains, and extreme snowfalls. Many of these houses are still inhabited today, which is the best proof of their quality. Modern technologies often fall short in durability compared to these simple yet ingenious solutions. Time has proven to be the best judge of the craftsmanship of medieval folk builders. It is worth noting that repairing such walls was ingeniously simple and incredibly cheap. If a deep crack appeared in the wall, there was no need to call in a team of specialists. A peasant would simply take a handful of fresh clay mixed with manure and quickly patch up the hole. Modern repairs require a trip to a huge hardware store and the purchase of expensive sealants. In the Middle Ages, the necessary material was literally right there under a cow's tail. This made maintaining a home practically free and accessible to anyone who wanted it. People weren't dependent on complex technologies or materials shipped from far away. Everything needed to keep a home in perfect order was always at hand. Such self-sufficiency allowed people to feel confident in any life situation. Repairs became a routine household task that didn't require special financial savings. This system of complete self-sufficiency made medieval settlements incredibly resilient to crises. Supply chains could not suddenly break down because they simply did not exist. All necessary building materials were produced right on site by the local residents themselves. It was the ideal model of a circular economy long before the term became fashionable. People simply took organic waste and turned it into a first-class building resource. Such harmony with nature allowed civilization to develop without harming the environment. All construction waste from that time was completely biodegradable and did not pollute the land. After a house was demolished, the walls simply turned back into fertilizer for the fields. This closed-loop resource cycle ensured the village's stable existence for centuries. Perhaps we should learn from our ancestors this simplicity and incredible efficiency in using what the earth provides.
And we help each other.
Insulating the walls was, in itself, only half of the complex equation of survival. A closed clay box without a heat source would inevitably freeze over time. The center of any medieval dwelling was always an open fire burning right on the floor. It was not a beautiful fireplace from romantic novels, but a simple earthen pit with coals. It was this fire that provided life, essential warmth, and the ability to cook hot food. Life in such a smoky room certainly came at a very high price. Many people suffered from constantly watery eyes and developed chronic lung diseases. Modern doctors would call this severe chronic carbon monoxide poisoning. But at that time, the harsh choice was between a severe cough and certain death from the cold. Surprisingly, the human body managed to adapt even to such harsh environmental conditions. People considered the smoky air a perfectly acceptable price to pay for warmth and the preservation of life. The fire on the hearth was kept burning around the clock. If it happened to go out, it was considered a real disaster. Rekindling the flames on a damp, cold winter day was an incredibly difficult task. Therefore, at night, the burning coals were carefully covered with ash so that they would smolder until morning. This method retained the heat inside the hearth, much like a modern, high-quality thermos filled with hot tea. In the morning, it was enough to toss in a little dry straw and quickly fan the flames into a full blaze. The heat from the hearth was always used with maximum, almost obsessive efficiency. A heavy pot hung constantly over the fire, in which a thick stew simmered slowly. The hot pot itself became an additional radiator, radiating heat into the room. Not a single joule of energy was wasted. Absolutely everything went toward heating and food. Today, engineers are trying in vain to achieve the same efficiency in modern energy-efficient homes. To conserve heat, people also use the body heat of their own farm animals. Often, cows, goats, and pigs spent the winter in the same small room as their owners. To modern city dwellers, this would surely seem the height of unsanitary conditions and utter barbarism. But the animals functioned as enormous living heaters with a constant body temperature of around 38 degrees. 2 cows in a small room provided as much heat as a powerful electric radiator. Moreover, wintering together ensured that the valuable livestock would not freeze to death outside. The animals were a poor family's main asset. Losing them meant certain starvation in the spring. The coexistence of humans and animals in the same space was dictated solely by harsh economic necessity. People heated the room with a blazing fire, while the animals contributed their own body heat. It was an ideal system of mutual survival in the freezing hell of the Middle Ages. The clay walls, mixed with manure, excellently retained this combined thermal energy. The air in the cramped room heated up and circulated, creating quite tolerable living conditions. While a snowstorm raged outside at -20 degrees, it was about 15 degrees Celsius inside. A 35-degree difference was easily achieved without a single kilowatt of electricity or gas. This is a true historical triumph of human ingenuity over the merciless forces of winter. Sleeping in such a house also had its own strict rules for maximum thermal efficiency. The whole family usually slept in one large bed, warming each other with their bodies. They used very thick woolen blankets that completely blocked out the cold air. Once again, we see the principle of heat accumulation brought to absolute physical perfection. Modern culture promotes individualism, but in the Middle Ages, being alone at night meant hypothermia. In addition to sturdy walls and a warm hearth, the proper construction of the roof played a huge role in preserving life. Roofs were made of tightly packed layers of reeds or straw, sometimes up to half a meter thick. This thick layer of vegetation created an incredibly powerful insulating barrier against falling snow. Snow settled on the roof in a heavy cap and served as additional insulation, functioning on the same principle as the igloos of the northern Inuit. The internal heat did not melt the snowdrift instantly because the straw reliably blocked the transfer of heat to the outside. In those days, the roof was not merely protection from the rain, but the most important element of the entire building's thermal regulation. The density of the laid-out reed stalks allowed millions of tiny air chambers to form inside them. It was precisely this still air inside the thick layer of straw that served as the best possible thermal insulator. In winter, such a roof became an insurmountable barrier against the biting cold trying to penetrate from above. Even during the harshest blizzards, a stable atmosphere and relative silence were maintained inside the house. The doors in such peasant houses were small, and the thresholds were made unusually high by modern standards. This was done deliberately to minimize the loss of precious heat as much as possible every time someone entered. The high threshold prevented heavy, cold air from quickly flowing into the house from ground level, much like water, and the low upper lintel reliably trapped the light, warm air right under the ceiling of the living room. These are the basic laws of gas physics, which simple peasants successfully applied on a purely intuitive level. Upon entering such a house, a person was forced to bow low, which was symbolically perceived as a gesture of respect toward the hearth. But in reality, this architectural feature was dictated by harsh climatic considerations and the logic of survival. Every square centimeter of the doorway was a potential source of a dangerous draft. Therefore, doors were made massive and lined with thick fabric or animal hides for added insulation. People understood that comfort inside depended directly on how effectively they sealed in the heat. Windows, in the modern sense of the word, were practically non-existent in ordinary peasant homes at that time. Clear glass was a fabulously expensive luxury, accessible only to kings and the highest nobility. Instead, ox bladders or very thick, oiled paper were inserted into small ventilation openings. They let in only a little dim light, but most importantly, they reliably kept the icy winter wind from entering. At night, these small openings were tightly sealed with heavy solid oak shutters. Due to the lack of large windows, the interior of the house remained in deep semi-darkness most of the time. The light from the hearth became the main focal point and center of all domestic life during the winter. Narrow slits in the walls served more to allow a minimal flow of oxygen than to provide a view of the surroundings. Peasants consciously sacrificed a view of the street to conserve every bit of heat. Such insulation allowed them to survive even on days when a full-blown snowstorm raged outside. The location of the peasant house itself was also chosen to provide maximum protection from the vagaries of the weather. Houses were often built in natural depressions or behind earthen embankments to shelter from the biting wind. The door always faced south or east to catch the sparse rays of the winter sun and warm up. The north wall, which bore the brunt of the elements, was often made completely solid without a single opening. This clever spatial design allowed for gaining extra degrees of warmth without unnecessary physical effort. People carefully observed the direction of the prevailing winds before laying the foundation for a new building. If winter blizzards blew from a certain direction in a given area, the house was oriented toward them, with its strongest corner facing the wind. Often, a barn or a woodpile was attached to the north side of the house, creating an additional buffer zone. This was a true science of land planning based on centuries of ancestral experience. Each house became part of the landscape, blending harmoniously into it to protect its inhabitants. This entire complex set of measures created a surprisingly effective ecosystem for self-sufficient survival. Walls insulated with manure, a thick thatched roof, animals in the house, and a hot hearth all worked as a single mechanism. The failure of even a single important element threatened a real catastrophe for all the inhabitants of the dwelling. Therefore, maintaining the old house in perfect condition was literally a matter of life and death. In the summer, prudent peasants constantly renewed the clay plaster and repaired the worn-out straw. Caring for the home was a continuous process that did not stop throughout the entire warm season. People understood that summer laziness would inevitably lead to winter suffering or the loss of loved ones. They gathered the necessary herbs, prepared the right clay, and dried manure in advance for autumn work. The entire annual cycle of life was subordinated to a single overarching goal: to prepare the fortress for the siege of the frosts. Such discipline and attention to detail allowed entire peoples to survive in extremely harsh climates. Interestingly, city dwellers of that time often suffered from the cold much more than ordinary peasants. Large cities were built up with multi-story wooden houses that were extremely drafty. There was no room for thick thatched roofs or for keeping cows in a cramped living room. Ordinary firewood in the city cost a fortune, and the poor literally froze to death right on the streets. Paradoxically, the village mud and free manure provided a higher level of comfort. In cities, the density of development did not allow for the benefits of properly orienting buildings toward the sun. Narrow streets turned into wind tunnels through which icy winds blew, carrying away the heat. Multi-story structures made of thin planks had terrible thermal insulation compared to thick mud brick houses. City dwellers were at the mercy of market prices for fuel and the logistics of hay and firewood deliveries. While a peasant was his own master, a city dweller depended on endless external factors. This historical paradox completely debunks the popular myth that city life has always been better than rural life. In the harsh conditions of the early Middle Ages, proximity to nature offered clear advantages. Peasants could use free resources that townspeople had to purchase with real gold coins. Natural materials, proper architecture, and hard labor outweighed any dubious urban comforts. Winter put everything in its place, mercilessly punishing those who had not prepared for it properly. Modern researchers often attempt to reconstruct such structures for the sake of rigorous scientific experiments. They note with great surprise that the microclimate in such houses is much more pleasant than one might expect. Clay regulates humidity perfectly, preventing the air from becoming excessively dry due to the constantly burning hearth. Mud walls absorb toxins and odors, acting as a giant natural charcoal filter. Ancient people accidentally created a ventilation and air conditioning system using the ordinary mud beneath their feet. Scientists have discovered that the composition of medieval plaster possessed unique antibacterial properties. The fermentation of organic additives in the clay created an environment in which pathogenic microbes were killed. This explains why people in such houses fell ill less often than in damp and cold stone castles. Modern science is only now beginning to understand the complexity of the processes that peasants initiated intuitively. We are accustomed to looking down on our ancestors, but their biological technologies were surprisingly advanced. Knowledge of these life-saving technologies was passed down from generation to generation without any written blueprints. An experienced father would simply demonstrate to his son how to properly mix clay with cow manure. This oral tradition proved far more reliable than any modern and complex construction documentation. It successfully survived bloody wars, plague epidemics, and the succession of numerous royal dynasties. The technology of survival proved to be the most valuable legacy that could be passed on to future generations. Masters taught young people to listen to the sound of the material and feel its consistency with their fingers. They knew thousands of nuances, from the composition of the water for mixing to the time of year for gathering the branches for the framework. This knowledge was not recorded in books, but it was stored in the muscle memory of millions of ordinary workers. It was precisely this living thread of experience that allowed humanity to survive the darkest and coldest of times. Every repaired wall was a contribution to the shared future of the great European civilization. The Industrial Revolution ruthlessly destroyed this ancient knowledge, quickly replacing it with bricks and cheap coal. People began moving en masse into crowded cities and gradually forgot how to build houses from earth. Factory-made materials became a symbol of progress, while sturdy clay mixed with manure came to be seen as a sign of shameful poverty. Society naively assumed that cheap fuel would always be available in unlimited quantities. This was the greatest mistake, for which the modern world is now paying a heavy price. Standardization and mass production have supplanted the individual approach and knowledge of the local environment. We have grown accustomed to the idea that a house is a box that can be built anywhere according to a single template. But in the pursuit of speed and cheapness, we have lost that very connection to the landscape that protected our ancestors. Modern residential developments are often completely defenseless against the elements without a constant supply of energy from outside. Our much-vaunted convenience has turned out to be extremely vulnerable and dependent on global resource distribution systems. Today, architectural trends are, quite unexpectedly, beginning to return to their ancient medieval roots. Trendy eco-builders are rediscovering the properties of rammed earth and straw bales. They euphemistically call this green architecture and charge exorbitant fees for such unique projects. Materials that were once considered a clear sign of extreme desperation have now become an elite, expensive trend. History has come full circle, definitively proving the genius of simple peasant solutions. In Europe and America, entire settlements are being built where walls are constructed from a mixture of clay and straw using traditional recipes. People are tired of plastic, concrete, and synthetic insulation that prevents walls from breathing. The return to natural materials is not just a fad, but a recognition of their superiority in terms of health. It turns out that life in a mud house is much more comfortable and eco-friendly than in a modern apartment. Wealthy clients are willing to pay millions for what their ancestors received completely free of charge. Of course, today few people add fresh cow manure to the plaster of incredibly expensive private villas. Modern chemistry allows for the use of polymer additives that perform the same binding function. However, the basic physics of the process remain absolutely unchanged since the distant 13th century. The thermal mass and porous structure of the material still excel at retaining heat in a large building. Ancient builders would surely laugh out loud if they knew how much their methods cost in the 21st century. We use new names for old principles of thermodynamics and building chemistry. The essence remains the same. We need to create a dense, inert mass capable of storing energy. Modern architects study old mud brick houses to understand how to do without forced air conditioning systems. It turns out that nature came up with all the best solutions long ago, and we just need to learn how to apply them. The experience of the past has become the foundation for future innovations in sustainable construction. The engineering mindset of that era operated under conditions of severe resource scarcity, which forced the mind to seek ideal solutions. Without computers, people calculated loads on beams and heat loss through walls. They felt materials by touch and knew how wood would behave under the pressure of snow. It was an era of masters whose knowledge was deeply rooted in reality, not in numbers on a screen. We should show more respect for those who laid the foundations of our comfort today. Survival in the harsh Middle Ages was not merely a matter of bravery on the bloody battlefield. The real battle took place every winter in millions of small peasant homes across Europe. The weapons in this invisible war were shovels, wet clay, dry straw, and animal waste. And people confidently won this war year after year thanks to their incredible stubbornness. Their dwellings were far from palatial luxury, but they flawlessly fulfilled their primary protective function. While kings argued over national borders, ordinary people fought for every degree of warmth. This quiet struggle was the true driving force behind technological progress among the common people. Each new generation added its own little tricks to the common cause of insulating homes. Without this collective feat, the settlement of the northern lands would have been simply impossible. The history of Europe is, above all, the history of people who learned to conquer the cold. Modern life support systems are incredibly fragile and critically dependent on thousands of external factors. A sudden power outage in winter in a modern metropolis quickly turns apartments into icy concrete caves. We live in an age of illusory security, relying on invisible pipes and cables. If this infrastructure fails, most of us will find ourselves helpless in the face of nature. Medieval people, on the other hand, had complete control over their life support systems. They built their own homes, gathered their own fuel, and repaired their own walls when necessary. This independence gave them a special inner strength and confidence in the future, despite all the hardships. It is astonishing to realize that the foundation of all modern civilization literally stands firmly on clay. If peasants had not invented this insulation technology, the population of Europe might simply have frozen to death. There would have been no glorious Renaissance, no great geographical discoveries, and no industrial revolutions of subsequent eras. Great historical events became possible only because ordinary people learned to survive the winter. Their dirty, routine work reliably ensured humanity's survival during the darkest centuries. It was precisely the warmth and safety of their homes that allowed people to think about something more than just a piece of bread. The preserved health of peasant families ensured a steady flow of labor and talent into the cities. Every great work of art or scientific discovery began with the author having a place to keep warm. We owe our very existence to those millions of nameless people who have been kneading clay for centuries. Their humble labor became the invisible cement that held the entire edifice of human history together. Studying such small, everyday details of history offers a completely different perspective on life. It quickly strips away the romanticized aura of the past and reveals its true, harsh reality. Knights in shining armor were only a tiny and not particularly important part of that vast world. The true heroes of the Middle Ages were the nameless builders who stubbornly trampled the icy clay with their feet. It was their colossal labor, sweat, and ingenuity that allowed humanity to safely survive into our comfortable modern age. The story of survival through manure and clay teaches us one very important lesson. The most effective solutions often lie literally at our feet if we know how to look closely. High technology and massive government budgets are not always required to overcome a complex problem. Sometimes it is enough simply to understand the basic laws of nature and use them wisely to our advantage. And in this art, the ancient peasants were absolute, unrivaled master engineers. This story brilliantly proves that genius does not depend on the era or technological development. Cornered by a merciless winter, ordinary people found salvation in the most unexpected things. What today provokes disgust meant the difference between life and death hundreds of years ago. Using excrement as a building material sounds like a bad joke or the desperation of a madman. But science has proven that it was a brilliant engineering calculation based on the properties of biopolymers. The modern world relies too often on complex mechanisms, forgetting simple natural laws. People expend enormous amounts of energy heating buildings that were originally constructed without any consideration for basic heat conservation. Ancient builders acted much more wisely, creating homes that functioned like giant thermoses. They did not fight nature, but skillfully integrated its elements to provide reliable protection from the cold. This approach is definitely worth studying by all modern engineers and developers of new eco-friendly materials. The knowledge of our ancestors is often reliably hidden behind an unattractive facade of dirty clay and straw. If we completely set aside modern arrogance, we can see incredible wisdom in the past. Every crack in an old mud brick wall holds within it centuries of survival experience from entire generations. And this experience undoubtedly deserves not ridicule, but deep, sincere respect from their descendants. After all, it was our ancestors who decisively won the most important climatic battle in human history. They reliably passed the baton of life to us, carrying it through the icy darkness of medieval winters. Their victory was made possible only through hard work and the ability to utilize absolutely every resource. Herein lies the main secret of history, one that is often deliberately ignored in textbooks and films. True history is not written on the grand battlefields, but in the humble huts of ordinary people. And it is written not with ink, but with clay, sweat, and an incredibly stubborn will to survive. It's hard to believe, but this story is sure to make viewers look at their familiar comforts in a different light. The next time you turn on a warm radiator, it's worth remembering those who had to trample manure with their feet. With that, our historical investigation into the forgotten technologies of harsh survival is coming to a close. Keep your homes warm and never forget the lessons of a harsh but resourceful past. Thank you for your attention, and see you in our next dives into the undiscovered secrets of world history.